I declare the meeting open and welcome to meeting 103 of Agriculture and Agri-Food Committee. I would like to remind you of a few points. The purpose, the meeting today will be in a hybrid format and deliberations will be posted on the website of the House of Commons. For your information, the webcasting will always show the person speaking rather than the entire committee, and of course, screen captures or photographs of your screen are not permitted.
And I'm going to just remind us, colleagues, because we have taken some additional measures to protect the health and well-being of our translators. So for the witnesses who may have not been privy to this yet, who are in the room, I guess that's you, Mr. Foray. Just if you're not using your headset, we'd ask that you keep it away from the microphone. And colleagues, please make sure that you wait until you're recognized so we don't have multiple microphones in play at the same time. I know that shouldn't be a problem. But we'll make sure that we keep the health and safety of our translators top in mind. We have a couple substitutions today. Welcome back, so to speak, Mr. Epp, regular in substitution at least, and certainly you're here for Mr. Steinley today, and we have Mr. Chang in for Mr. Carr, and ultimately who will be, Miss Murray will be joining our committee on the Liberal side, I'm told. So we'll look forward to having another voice from British Columbia to join Mr. McGregor. And pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion adopted by the committee on Thursday, November 2nd, 2023, the committee is resuming its study of issues relating to the horticulture sector. And I'd now like to welcome our panelists here today. Avec nous aujourd'hui, avec Financement Agricole Canada.
We have with us today, with Farm Credit Canada, Jean-Philippe Gervais, Executive Vice President, Strategy and Impact and Chief Economist.
Still waiting on Mr. Trugango. Oh, he is here, okay. From the Ontario Tender Fruit Growers, avec les producteurs de légumes de transformation.
From Pascal Forêt from the Producteurs de légumes de transformation du Québec. Welcome, President of the organization.
Peter Vinyl, who is the president, joining us by video conference. So great to have all of you here. Colleagues, we're going to move as quickly as we can because we do have 4 witnesses in this panel, and we have up to 5 minutes for each organization. So I'll start with Farm Credit Canada. Mr. Gervais, you have up to 5 minutes. Over to you.
Well, good afternoon, Mr. Chair and members of the committee. Thank you for inviting me to join you today. My name is Jean-Philippe Gervais, and I'm the Executive Vice President of Strategy and Impact and Chief Economist at Farm Credit Canada, or FCC. FAC est une société d'État fédéral dédiée à l'industrie agricole et agroalimentaire canadienne.
We have a portfolio of nearly $50 billion, including 102,000 clients and 3,200 employees and 103 offices around the country, and provides the industry with financial services and advisory services, software, and industry knowledge. And we provide broad support to customers in the horticultural industry, including greenhouse, field, vegetables, and fruit sectors. As of March 31, 2024, FCC's total horticultural portfolio was 3,576 customers with 4.77 billion of total owing. This represents 6.3% of FCC's overall customer base and 9.4% of our portfolio balance. Regionally, British Columbia, Ontario, and Quebec contribute the largest amount to the horticultural industry.
FCC customers in the industry. The greenhouse sector has experienced disease outbreaks, which combined with a tighter profitability environment because of elevated interest rates and input costs have led to an increase in impaired loans in the sector. In the fruit sector, adverse weather conditions and high input costs as well have led to increases in impaired loans. Overall, these financial challenges are not currently significant at our portfolio level and represent less than 5% of total owing by the greenhouse and fruit sectors. FCC is currently offering additional support to fruit and wine sector customers in BC who are facing financial hardship as a result of prolonged cold temperatures over the winter and the significant resulting damage to wine vines and fruit trees across the province. In addition, last summer's severe drought and wildfires adversely affected tourism, a critical source of revenue for many wineries in the region. The 2023 Adverse Weather Customer Support Program has been in effect since last July. Customer support is a central part of FCC's business, and we consider a variety of credit and deferral options to reduce the financial pressures on producers. We also provide knowledge to help producers make informed business decisions. For example, we will be releasing the 2023 FCC Fruit Land Value Analysis tomorrow on May 8th. Pour les producteurs de fruits de verger et fruits tendres de l'Ontario,
in contrast, Ontario orchard and tender fruit growers, the majority of whom are in Niagara, are witnessing a period of robust crop quality and strong prices, and the Quebec apple market remains stable in the Atlantic region. There has been a persistent issue of excess supply in fruit, especially blueberries, wild blueberries, which is straining the market, which demonstrates the wide regional disparity in the horticulture industry, specifically in the fruit production. FCC is committed not only to supporting our customers through these adverse events, but also helping all affected to be more resilient and disaster resistant in the future.
Thank you very much, Mr. Gervais. We're now going to turn to Mr. Triungo with the Ontario tree fruit growers, I believe. Go ahead, over to you.
Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you today. My name is Phil Trigano. I'm chair of the Ontario Tender Fruit Growers. Our organization represents all growers of stone fruit and pears across Ontario with a farm gate value in 2023 of over 85 million. I myself am a fruit grower. Our family operates 700 acres of tender fruit and grapes in Niagara-on-the-Lake. And we're fully invested in the future. Our farm is right along the Niagara River. As an outdoor crop, we face many weather challenges and rely primarily on crop insurance to provide a safety net. Frost and freeze are our main perils, with an average of 83% of all claims when things like that happen. Climate change, it's resulted in more erratic swings in temperatures, and winter was no exception, with warm February and March temperatures resulting in full bloom April 7th to 10th. That was days earlier than 2023. And when I started farming, it's about a month earlier. We used to have blossom time usually on Mother's Day, and now it seems to be a month earlier. Temperatures fluctuated a fair bit. The last full moon, we had -3 degrees Celsius. We expected a little bit of damage from that, but luckily everything seems to have come through, and we expect a full crop. Drought and high heat as a result of climate change are also perils that we face, and we definitely have a lot of impact as a result of that. At that point in time, of course, we have all our labor and all our inputs for the season in, and so it is a very hard hit for farms. The big part about this is a lot of this is site specific. In some of these cases, you can have freezes or hailstorms or whatever in one site, and the nature of Niagara is that there's a lot of smaller farms that are not necessarily adjoining parcels. So site-specific insurance is something that we've been really pushing for, and it's something that's really important. Agricor delivers production insurance and programs, and we're working with them to make changes to the plans to make them more responsive to our particular risks. We believe that rather than that whole farm, one of our real asks is to get into site-specific coverage. We've been blocked on that on a number of reasons. Some of the case is the funding between the federal and Ontario governments in that. They've also said that moral hazard is also an issue as far as having site-specific coverage, and we've developed a farm management software, crop tracker, that we can certainly believe that we would overcome any sort of moral hazard with that. Our use of agri-stability, it also operates on a whole farm basis, and it's really a disaster insurance. The nature of Niagara is we grow multiple crops, and to trigger a benefit on a whole farm basis is less likely in our sector. So agri-stability has not really been too beneficial to us. Our main operation, it really is for crop insurance. That's the real need in having a working good crop insurance system. We've also received funding from AAFC to continue new variety development with focus on climate change and import replacement. Funding will take us to 2028, and we hope it will result in some hardier varieties that can better withstand frost, freeze, drought, and high heat events. The funding also includes a life cycle analysis, carbon sequestration platform, investigation of potential best management practices, and reduce the on-farm greenhouse gas. We continue to work at a provincial level for Niagara region-wide irrigation system. Some of us that are close to things like the Niagara River have some real benefit. Other areas have no access to raw water. It's something that we desperately need to produce fruit across the whole area and mitigate some climate issues. We're looking for federal infrastructure dollars to construct a region-wide system and make upgrades in the Niagara Lake system. Labor is a real key issue for us, very seasonal, and lately we've been informed from ESDC that they're going to make some changes to the seasonal agricultural worker program. It's a program that has been there for 58 years, and we feel there's a tremendous amount of oversight to it and very beneficial, and we're worried a little more than worried that ESDC will lump it in with some of the other temporary programs and not treat us the same way as we have been over the years with the seasonal aspect of the nature of growing fruit.
Thank you, Mr. Trigano. I apologize, we're just over time. I gave you a little bit extra time. I appreciate you being able to make the sentiment on the labor piece. One thing I'm being advised by our clerk, I know you have a bit of a background that is kind of blurred. It seems to be maybe perhaps slowing down a little bit of your connection speed. So maybe if that's something as we go to our other witnesses you can play around with or work with our technical team, we would appreciate that. I'm going to turn now to Monsieur Forêt, 5 minutes, allez-y.
Mr. Forêt, you have 5 minutes. Please go ahead. Thank you, Chair. Ladies and gentlemen, members of Parliament, I thank you for giving me the time to listen to our concerns about the future of the horticultural sector. I'm Pascal Forêt, president of the APLTQ, and also a member of the Council of the Fruit and Vegetable Growers of Canada and a fifth-generation grower. The current risk management programs are no longer sufficient. There are changes in weather that cause the effectiveness of these programs and specific aid made available to horticulturists leave a lot to be desired. We have been affected by historic excesses of rain. On August 4th last, we asked for emergency help from the government of Quebec, which then turned toward the federal government in order to trigger the agri-recovery program following that disaster. Unfortunately, more than 9 months went by since our request for assistance, and we're still waiting for an answer. The situation involves substantial economic impacts for many horticultural producers. In the short term, we need to increase the responsiveness, the response time for catastrophes, and improve our risk management programs given sudden and substantial impact caused by climate change. In fact, concerns about food resiliency have to be taken seriously. It would be irresponsible to believe that the Canadian population is not exposed to risks of shortages of fruits and vegetables that are fresh due to climate impacts and episodes and considerable losses of yield that result more and more frequently. It would be an illusion to think that in the medium and long term, the existing programs will cover the costs connected with climate change or foster an ability to adapt on a scale needed to face these impacts. Economic profitability of our horticultural farms is under pressure, and the industry of retail and wholesale has concentrated a lot in recent years. 5 players account for 3/4 of the market share in the retail sector in Quebec, whereas the vast majority of food wholesalers are owned by foreign interests. The imbalance of power in the market between major retailers and farmers is accentuating pressure. Production costs are rising, but the retail and wholesale giants are driving down prices by putting us in competition against foreign products. However, in many cases, society and environmental standards of those exporting countries are more permissive, which results in unfair competition. The Canadian government must better protect horticultural producers. If the major players refuse to sign on voluntarily to a code of conduct, it must be imposed soon rather than later. For my part, at the end of May, it is an ultimatum. It's been too long that the situation has been continuing. Furthermore, the Canadian government must be more energetic in its efforts to demand reciprocity for standards from foreign products. As a summary, while the Canadian population now accounts for 40 million inhabitants, we have to make sure that enough horticultural farmers want to hold the fort. On a personal note, my children and nephews are no longer convinced that their occupational future is based on taking over the business, which is the result of 5 generations of work. It's urgent to change, to get them to change their opinion. Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Forêt. And finally, Mr. Vinyl, for 5 minutes, please.
Yes, good morning, Mr. Chair, members of the committee. My name's Peter Vinyl. I'm the president of Sustain Technologies. This morning I'm joined by Kevin Cameron, our senior vice president of business development. Thanks for giving us the opportunity to speak to you today about how Sustain is uniquely positioned to assist the horticulture sector in meeting the government's climate change goals through the reduction of plastics waste and the use of society's organics as a negative carbon fertilizer. We were founded in 2014. We're based in Halifax, and Sustain is a Canadian clean tech company, and we're on a mission to improve waste circularity, materially reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and then have a global impact with our solutions. Every year, Canadians throw away over 2.5 million tons of plastic waste. Only 9% of plastic that are actually recycled in Canada and North America. The rest end up in landfills, in the environment, threatening our health, wildlife, rivers, lakes, and oceans. Certainly, plastics can be, certain kinds of plastics rather, can be replaced with biodegradable alternatives. Single-use plastics, however, play a critical role in healthcare and food safety, amongst other things. For example, the horticultural sector needs to use plastics to transport goods to markets. And while there's a desire to reduce the sector's carbon footprint, there are very few cost-effective or viable alternatives in production, distribution, and transportation. And that's where our sustainable solution comes in. At Sustain, we're focused on improving waste circularity by repurposing single-use and end-of-life plastics back into plastic precursors. So we can take end-of-life plastic and put it back into the plastic food chain, or so to speak. Through our proprietary mechanized process, we're able to recycle up to 90% of landfill-destined waste into plastic precursors, negative carbon fertilizer, replacing the current high carbon processes. We're already doing that in Nova Scotia at our fully scaled demonstration plant in Chester, where in addition to municipal solid waste, we also process plastic from the federal government's Ghost Gear cleanup program, agricultural waste from farmers. Just last month, we signed an agreement with Wetaskiwin County in Alberta to build a facility there, which will also process some of their agricultural waste, improving the carbon footprint of farming in the province. We've also signed a memorandum of understanding with Washington State, and we're planning our expansion into the United States. At a community level, our innovative approach to use waste management reduces a municipality's carbon footprint by up to 10% through the prevention of up to 3 tons of greenhouse gas emissions for every ton of waste that we would process. Mr. Chair, Sustain believes that industry needs to be responsible in the use of plastics, but that government must also recognize that for many processes, plastics are the only economically viable material for the immediate future. If the government truly wants to support our agriculture sector, it should be funding circular economy projects that can process horticultural waste and support extended producer responsibility programs to fight climate change. We should also be working to support the sector through the adoption of new technologies as they become available. Canada has the opportunity to lead on agricultural sustainability. By investing in solutions that promote waste circularity, Canada can not only achieve its climate goals without punitive measures on industry, but it can help bring a mature, made-in-Canada technology that's in high demand around the world. Thanks again for the opportunity for us to appear. more than happy to answer any questions you might have, and I hope you really have the opportunity to visit our Chester, Nova Scotia plant and see our cutting-edge technology in action. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vinyl. And yes, as the proud Member of Parliament for King Sance, I invite any Canadian and all committee members to come to Nova Scotia and come see our beautiful province, whether Sustained Technologies or otherwise. With that, we're going to turn it over to questions. Mr. Epp, welcome to the committee. Great to have you back. Over to you for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses for excellent testimony. I'm going to start with Mr. Phil Triguno. Sir, what's a nectarine and how long has the industry been growing them in Ontario?
Well, a nectarine is it's a rather interesting story because most of the varieties are American nectarines that we've transplanted over here and have taken off. And in a lot of the other areas, nectarines are basically 50% of the markets, 50% peaches, 50% nectarines. And we're likely about 30-70 in Canada right now. So it's fairly attractive.
So what's one of the issues been holding back getting that 50-50 balance? As I understand, and I have copies of an exchange of letters from your industry to the CFIA, I understand the industry's been going through an exercise in grading. Can you explain? Because I can hardly believe that I read it's been a 14-year process and it's not completed yet. Is that correct?
That's correct. We initially got nectarines brought in as a test, and we were told that that we would have a grade schedule out there. And it was supposed to be completed in the last year or two after 14 years. And instead, we were just sent something that it would continue on as a test.
So there's an initial pilot that was started 14 years ago under a different government. So, like, where is the delay? My understanding is that the industry has actually developed the standards. Is this not a review, adopt, and process, or where is the holdup?
The holdup is at the CFIA. We've put in all the documentations. The industry has sent everything into the CFIA, so it effectively just needs approval.
When did the industry submit that information?
It's gone in, I would say, 4 or 5 years ago at least. And we were told it'd be completed by this year.
What is the effect on the supply chain for this delay?
Our retailers in that had great concern because they would not be able to advertise it as Canada #1 in the as far as the grade is concerned. So we would have had to, even though all our cartons and containers are printed ahead of time, we would have had to somehow or other redo all those cartons and containers. So we wouldn't be able to have it labeled as Canada #1.
Is this a food safety issue?
Absolutely not. It's a grading issue. So it's, things like sizing or marks or something like that. It's straight, it's basically to get something across someone's desk and get it accomplished.
Has there been any viable reason given why it's taken 4 years since the department has had all the information?
No, other than it's a Safe Food for Canada Act that they're working on. So.
Thank you. I'm going to turn my attention to a colleague of mine from 30 years ago, Monsieur Forêt. Je ne parle pas français, mais je prends français avec
Mr. Forêt, I don't speak French, but I'm learning it.
So, working on it. You listed a number of issues facing the horticultural industry. When you interact with the retailers and their choices to bring in imported produce versus Canadian produce, be it on the fresh or on the processed. I know our intersection was on the processed side. Presently, you're here in more in the fresh capacity. What is the reaction of additional plastics burden costs, carbon tax issues that the farmers face and the producers face? How is that taken into account by the retailers?
Évidemment, pour ma part, je pourrais
Of
pas
course, for
répondre.
my part, I cannot answer Canada why, because for fresh vegetables, I can only speak about the United States. So, of course, the pressure that is placed on producers will not reduce the production costs. Of course, everything that is added drives up the cost. And then after that, we're asked to provide a better price to bring it down for Canadians to pay less. Everything that's added on, if my competitor is importing them here, if they don't have the same requirements, then obviously we lose ground every time.
You and I intersected. I'm going to take a little license here. We both grew for the same processor. I grew green beans in Ontario. You grew them in Quebec for the same multinational processor. Competing with green beans from New York, from Minnesota. We had many, many discussions about this. Again, does that same dynamic apply in the process side that you just articulated in the fresh side?
In 20 seconds, unfortunately.
Okay. Well, c'est certain que
Well, of course, this competition, if we don't have the same regulations, then clearly we're going to be at a disadvantage. Absolutely. That's my 20 seconds.
Very young, 30 years ago.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Rep, Monsieur Forêt.
Thank you, Ms. Rep and Mr. Forêt. Now, Mr. Drouin, you have 6 minutes. If you please, go ahead. Thank you very much, Chair.
Just quickly, Mr. Treguno, you've just your exchange with Mr. Rep. I'd be happy to follow up on your behalf if we can get in touch after this committee with regards to the issue you've raised, and be happy to be helpful for you. Ma première question serait dirigée vers.
My first question is for Mr. Gervais. Quite simply, I'm trying to get an understanding of whether you've noticed within your institution, in spite of all the challenges that the agricultural sector has faced, whether it be climate change and so on. I won't list them all, but there are a number of them. I would just like to know whether you've noticed a specific trend in terms of loans and how FCC AC has dealt with situations that are not necessarily predictable, such as the weather. Well, to answer your question in terms of the situation for us, the key is the proactive approach with the farms we deal with or the businesses we deal with. Of course, we're familiar with the challenges and climate change and all the production challenges resulting. So the main thing is to be proactive initially. The same thing with other challenges with high interest rates. We were proactive when we saw interest rates going up. We worked with customers to see what were the most appropriate solutions for their businesses. And the challenge is really to try to deal with the specific situation of each business, because not everyone is at the same degree of transition, volume, and growth, and so on. So there are a number of different components to be taken into account. But the main aspect that we see when we establish assistance programs for these clients based on challenges related to production. There's one we've just launched for producers in BC, and there's one that existed for 1 year, not only for horticultural producers, but for the entire chain, different production sectors in connection with drought and extreme heat that we saw in 2023. So I think that the approach is individualistic and also proactive to try to get as much assistance as we can with the clients and get the most interesting solutions. And I'd like to say that now if we look forward, we try to help producers or assist the businesses in implementing the management practices or production practices to improve their resiliency facing climate change. For example, we have a financial incentive program where we work with partners. We don't do it all alone, but in partnership. So we have 6 existing programs now, and others are being developed. And another aspect is to develop sustainable financing programs. We now have a framework that we're working on to set the principles we'll work on to be able to provide financial products that will enable businesses to bring in certain changes within their business. And I can understand that when there is a crisis that occurs, say, once a year. But what we realize now is that sometimes a producer may face several crises in a row from year to year. And if there's a cash flow problem, then it becomes a heavy burden for farmers who are unfortunately facing these crises. So how do you work with them when these are consecutive crises that occur that they have to deal with, where the whole range of programs has never been, how should I say it, the architecture of these programs was never designed according to crises that disrupt things year after year with uncontrollable variables. I think that you've expressed it very clearly. I think the main challenge is when you add several factors together, where there's consecutive aspects, even the same kind of issue with unexpected production variations or a variation in production related to climate conditions that is unfavorable, in addition to an increase in the interest rate. So usually in the sector, based on what I've seen over the years, that one crisis or one incident, the businesses are generally well equipped to be able to get through a period like that. It's when there are several incidents, then I think it makes it more complicated. The whole business environment for farm businesses in the entire range, including horticultural sector, given the major challenges in recent years. But I think the approach now is to be able to get solutions in the longer term. And the advantage, if you will, for a business such as ours is it's the only agricultural sector for us in FCC to do it on an ongoing basis. So there is a commitment, so to speak, on a durable basis. So if we can have a longer term view to be able to, sure, we've seen, and I mentioned this in the opening remarks, there can be an increase in loans in difficult conditions, but at the same time, we know that in the course of time, we'll be able to deal with those loans and help those businesses to perform well and deal with the production and financial practices. Thank you. Mr. Foray, I know that you made a presentation when you were talking with your producers with risk management programs. I think you talked about the reasons why they don't necessarily respond to the situations they deal with. So what suggestions can you give us on that? Of course, thank you for the question. Of course, the speed with which the programs intervene will make a big difference. Of course, last year that we've gone through, we're starting our season now, and we have no assistance, no compensation, which ought to have come through because we planned on this and we did the work we needed to, but it just takes too long. I understand the bureaucracy, but those programs, food is a day-to-day thing. You cannot wait a year or 2 years and think about it later and talk it over later. That's not the way it works. Most producers, what they complain about is really the time frame. It's how much time it's going to take between the disaster and the settlement. Thank you very much. Mr. Parent, 6 minutes. Please go ahead, sir. Thank you, Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses for being here today. Mr. Foray, we're continuing along. You're on a good direction. The important thing is the duration or how quickly these things come through. Agri-recovery in November, now it's May 6th. Do you have a comment about that? Of course, I just said it. It takes a long time. And I really don't know how it could be said differently than the way it was raised. There are certain dates involved. There are certain ways of doing things. And I think that we did everything right. But now I'm here really to hear the answers. So when you prepare your season, now we're in May. So maybe it's important for people in their offices, the ones who do the calculations, to know that your season isn't just starting now. It's been started for some time. Your orders and have gone in, and we're talking about cash flow. When did you put in your orders to prepare for the next season? The cash flow crunch is now, the seeds, the fertilizer, the workers, the plane tickets, and so on. All of that is on an ongoing basis. Since October, the applications for foreign workers have been done, so it's on an ongoing basis. So among your members, do you know if there are any businesses that are thinking about perhaps letting it go this year or changing their production? Of course, at the last minute like this, I don't think so, but people putting everything into question. I hear about that. There are people who've been in it for many years, like in our case. We really wonder about it because I don't think we're going to be able to continue fighting with all these countries sending in production. They send in products and they have this much assistance and we have much less assistance, visually speaking, with my hands, but that's where the difference lies. So now you're dealing with the reciprocity of standards. This is a major issue that we often discuss in the committee and over which we haven't seen much change. Do you have any specific recommendations to make, whether it could be sent in writing later if you have some recommendations? If we don't demand the same thing for the products coming in from outside the country, perhaps we should give more support to our people because we'll end up with no domestic production. And in the COVID crisis, we saw that perhaps we wanted to have local vegetables. The sad thing about that is, sure, it's very important. If we go to war and we have the same weapons, then it's more equal. But if the products that we no longer have access to, we're no longer entitled to use that, but the competitors are allowed to use them, well, then the answer is simple. We won't be able to fight. It's quite clear. So it really requires speed. And the work is being done well. We're reviewing our products, but it takes 5 years. So at the end of 5 years, well, we have a similar phenomenon when it comes to certifying products. I think you remember there was a recent example where we had a major issue and we ended up in a situation where a foreign product was coming in that was using the same molecule, whereas here we were not allowed to use that molecule. So we're talking about speed. That's one of your recommendations. And the previous witnesses talked about the need for something speedier than agri-recovery, some sort of agri-catastrophe or agri-disaster that could release funds quickly. Do you have an answer on that? I've heard those comments from colleagues, and I agree with them in the sense that it's just like having a disaster in a house. You don't want to wait 2 years before you rebuild. You want to get started and keep on going. Agriculture is continually moving forward. You end one season and then soon you start the next season. So the speedier, the better. As regards the problems related to interest rates, which have increased the costs a lot, you have to realize that agriculture is a field that requires a lot of investment in order to get a return. Is $8 invested for $1 of return. Can you talk to us a bit about that? Maybe there's something the governments could do. I know that farmers in Quebec are highly mobilized right now on that and with the Quebec government, but part of the portfolio is from the federal government. What can the federal do? I think that the demands on the federal, we need protection against interest rates and cap them at a certain level in order to be able at least to get through the time period when interest rates until they come down again at the short to medium term. It would help us out in order to make a bridge between the two. You talked about the code of conduct in your statement as well, and some bargaining clout. When you sell a perishable product, of course, often you're stuck and you have to give in at the last minute. And we've recently seen examples where even suppliers had delivered perishable merchandise to grocers and they called them back to pick up 2/3 of the order a few days later. Are you aware of those examples? Have you seen examples like that? What can you say about that, about the importance of it? The important thing is that we are a business that more often than not is a family business up against a multinational. So obviously, the concentration of distribution really does not help for us to be able to benefit from that because they almost have a life or death impact over us, and we have no other option. As I said earlier, we're dealing with the U.S. It's different on the other side of the border. Mr. Parent, thank you very much.
And maybe a reminder, let's keep our phones on silent. I know that happens sometimes. And just a reminder to our witnesses to keep their cameras on. I think that would be you, Mr. Vinyl, if you could. There you go, my friend, because folks might want to ask you questions. Over to you, Mr. McGregor.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thanks to all of our witnesses for joining us today. Mr. Faure, I'd like to start with you. in the horticulture sector, especially over the last 4 years, can you tell me what it's been like in terms of your input costs, and generally across the sector? Like, what's the trend been like since 2019, 2020 up to now?
It went up, for sure.
And by how much would you say? Considerably? Like,
Oh, considerably.
far
Yes.
more than you've ever seen in your
Oh,
career?
Of course.
Okay. And did you know that during that same time, when you look at oil and gas costs, fertilizer costs, have you've been aware that the companies in those sectors have seen some of their best years like ever on record?
Agree with
Yeah.
you.
So I think like we're seeing a story in Canada where at both ends of the food supply chain, the consumer and the primary producers are really getting the short end of the stick, while we have a lot of people in the middle, whether it's the people who supply the inputs, the people who control how food is retailed, are having some of their best years ever. And so when you see a situation that's developed in Canada, and this is not just over the last 8 years, I think this has been a development over 40 years through successive Liberal and Conservative governments. Like, from your perspective, like, how should the federal government intervene to try and swing the pendulum back so that it's fair both for people in your sector, but also for consumers at the other end?
Je vais faire en français. C'est clair que
I'll answer in French. Clearly, what would be interesting to see in there and to feel supported by the government, the first response, I would like to just live based on the market. I want to earn money from the market, not through subsidies or government assistance. That's a basic thing. Of course, my competitor receives assistance, so then I need assistance too. So we have to have a level playing field. It has to be fair play to be equal, the same weapons. So if there's competition, fine. If we're on an equal footing, we can fight on equal basis. That's clear for me. Of course, to have reciprocity of standards, having the same phytosanitary products and the same conditions for foreign workers, it's very complex every year. There are always surprises. And one surprise we don't have is the production. Every year it's at the same date. Everyone is going to eat in the morning, lunch, and evening. There's no surprise there.
You talked about the challenges of getting the next generation, like your own, because they're looking at the state of farming and the challenges, and they're saying that's not something I want to put myself through. You've talked about a number of subjects, but I just want to look at the existing suite of business risk management programs. You've talked about the delays between when you put in a claim and when payment is issued. I think two of the programs that are most currently cited during this study are agri-stability and agri-insurance. We have the current agricultural partnership lasts until 2028. When you look at agri-insurance and agri-stability, which one of those programs do you think would be best to be reformed to be more responsive?
je pense que tous les programmes doivent être revus.
I think that all the programs need to be reviewed in order to make sure that, sure, things change, agriculture changes, temperature changes, markets adapt, not necessarily in the short term, but I think we need to be sure that we're going to try to cover everything. But we heard Francis say that earlier. The amplitude of the temperature fluctuations, we've never seen that much before. So if we want something that responds as quickly as the temperature changes or weather changes, obviously we're going to be left out.
No, thank you for that. I think that's been a common theme is that, especially during this study, farmers from every sector have been telling us they are on the front lines of climate change. We just heard a witness say that blossoms are coming out a month earlier than when he first started. So thank you for adding your expertise to that. I want to turn my next question to Sustain Technologies. I was just recently in Vancouver at the Canadian Produce Marketing Association. They hosted their big trade show at the Vancouver Convention Centre. And a big topic there was indeed on the use of plastics in the industry. There was a panel discussion on not only the role government should play, but also the role that industry also has to play. I represent a riding on a coastal environment, so microplastics is a very real concern of ours, given that it eventually ends up in the ocean, and there's significant concern about bioaccumulation, especially in the seafood that we consume on the coast. I just wanted to hear a little bit more detail from you on the role that you think the government can be playing, because I think we're at two polar opposites currently. We've got what the government's put on offer and what the Conservatives are countering with. It sounds like you're trying to find a more nuanced middle path. I'm just wondering if you could explain a little bit more about that.
Yeah, no, thanks so much for the question. Plastic waste obviously is an issue that goes across all sectors, including agriculture, and we've got a solution that can help with that. We can take the least recyclable plastic that goes into a landfill, even the plastic you put on the curb for recycling, typically 50% of that doesn't get recycled. It ends up in the landfill. So we can take those streams and recycle them with our technology. We have an offtake with a petrochemical group that is now confirmed that they can use our product. They've told us it's the best in the world. And this is a product called naphtha that we make from plastic. Our quality is the best, we're being told, and it can be used as a drop-in replacement for fossil naphtha to make plastic. And so that's a breakthrough that we're really proud of, and we're hoping to scale now. The other point I think I would make is that we hear about plastic in the ocean a lot, and that doesn't come from Canada. That comes from other countries. But in Canada, we freely export our waste plastic to other countries, and we call that recycling. So I think there's a role for government to put an end to that, frankly. Wish cycling, is a term that I hear a lot lately. We put it out on the curb. We think it's going to get recycled. Reality is a lot of it gets exported to other countries that don't have our standards for and controls. And I think that's a clear role for government to say enough of that. We have a made in Canada solution that can take these plastics in Canada, turn them back into feedstock, circularize plastic, and put an end to that. So that'd be my response.
Thank you, Mr. McGregor. Thank you, Mr. Vinyl. Maintenant, Monsieur Lehoux pour 5 minutes, s'il vous plaît.
And now, Mr. Lehoux, for 5 minutes, please. Thank you, Chair, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today. Mr. Forêt, I'd like to start with you. You made a brief presentation on the Code of Conduct. I understood that after May 31st, if there's no agreement, we have to come out with something and it ought to be mandatory. Are you confirming that today? Because I share your viewpoint, but I'd like to hear it from you. Well, I confirm that it is important, that it should really become something serious. In production, we're serious. It's important that we be taken seriously and respected. And I think what I said earlier, that the concentration of distribution results in those people being too powerful. So we will never be able to compete with family businesses, whether they're small, medium, or large-sized businesses against multinationals. It would take something that will give a framework with respect for both sides. So you agree with the viewpoint where they say that if all the major players don't get on board, then they ought to be forced to because everybody has to be on board? Absolutely. Thank you. And continuing along the same line, the whole question of foreign workers, you mentioned that earlier, and year after year, there are people in my region in the same situation. What changes should be made? Because we heard earlier, I don't remember from which witness who talked to us about a possible amendment to the foreign workers program that is in the works with the federal government right now. It doesn't seem to be done from a viewpoint of further improving. It might worsen the situation. What is your viewpoint on that? Should those timelines be shortened substantially? Honestly, 20 years ago, it took 6 weeks, and 20 years later, it takes 6 months. I think with the technology, we can do better than that, honestly. According to you, the major issue is the administrative burden of the system. It's a waste of time. 20 years ago, it was 6 weeks, and now the technology ought to bring it down to 3 months rather than a year. I think we're past the facts and the envelope. I think things should move faster than that. Quite frankly, today, it seems like it's desirable to have it long. I don't understand the principle because I don't really understand it. No, it's not to your education level. I'm discouraged by it too. Foreign workers, if I take my own case, the people I had 20 years ago, I still have some of those people working for us now. So there's absolutely nothing that has changed. It's all the same. It's a copy and paste, but yet studies are being done that we know very well that are a waste of time, but the machine is running for that instead of doing something productive. Thank you. I think that's very clear. Thank you, Mr. Forêt. Reciprocity of standards. You mentioned several times, my colleagues raised that with you as well. But the Canadian Food Inspection Agency, in collaboration with Border Services, because we know that they must be brought in as well. What ought to be what should we do to improve that aspect? Because they have a role to play, the CFIA, and there's a role too in the red tape that is substantial in approving different products. But when those products arrive here, what can the CFIA do in collaboration with the border services to improve the situation? If we had the same standards already there, whether it's with the USA and ourselves, we could consider it almost as the same farming. We're growing the same vegetables with the same practices, not the same season, of course, but they're the same. So for part of the year, the Americans use our products, and part of the year, the Americans eat our products, and it's about 50-50. I don't know the exact ratio. But if we harmonize the regulations, that would help things. So there ought to be exchanges on a very substantial basis between both levels, whether it's for our American neighbors. We would need some talks soon because the border is 5,000 kilometers long and a lot of products cross over, as you said, going in both directions. So there ought to be further effort from Agriculture Canada to contact them and try to go further into that approval process for some products that are being used on the other side but not used here to facilitate it. Those who do the certification of products, the companies that manufacture those products for plant protection, they should have the same label, whether it's in Canada or the USA. That's the problem. In your opinion, Mr. Forêt, the verifications that are done at customs, because we understand that they cannot verify every load, but according to what you see in the field, what you see going through, because you no doubt have some colleagues not far from the American border with products coming in, is there a sufficient frequency of checks of products entering Canada on that aspect of reciprocity? I'm not sure if I can answer your question. Of course, when you go across, in my case, when we have trucks going across to the USA, they verify it very seriously. I don't know how they do it on the way into Canada when there are American products or Mexican products entering. I have doubts about it, but I have no evidence of that. Thank you. Thank you very much. And now the honorable colleague from Malpac, 5 minutes, sir.
But I just wanted to, we're sitting around this table with a lot of growers, obviously, and there's one lowest common denominator, and that's climate change. And you do have some solutions for that. But I wanted to ask you, and I read some of your preamble, how small can you go as far as sectors or industries? I know you talk about communities and provinces like Nova Scotia and Alberta, et cetera. That's great. But sometimes provinces are slow to react. Governments are slow to react. And I'm just wondering about industries or sectors, and has there been any discussions with, say, for example, the Canadian Federation of Agriculture or someone like that about technologies and what you're doing?
Yeah, no, thanks for the question. In fact, we've been in discussions with a number of agricultural groups that would represent the collection of plastic, agricultural plastic that's used for growing, and we're working to find a way to bring that into either standalone conversion facilities or into our larger systems where we take regular garbage. So with our technology, we have the ability to take multiple streams, including dedicated waste streams from agriculture, as an example. Not all plastic types are chemically recyclable, which is what we do, but about 80% are. And in fact, most agricultural waste plastics are polyethylene and polypropylene polymers, and those are the most recyclable in terms of chemical recycling, which is the approach that we take. The physical form of these plastics often is the challenge for mechanical recycling. They're films, they're thin, they're all different sizes and shapes. And but with our process, we have the ability to shrink them down, compact them, and then put them into our depolymerization system to effectively 100% recycle them on an infinite basis. So unlike mechanical recycling, where you try to sort of melt the polymers and blend them, you only get 1 or 2 chances to do that. With chemical recycling, it's infinite. We can do this over and over again.
Also, Mr. Vinyl, I'm splitting my time today with the chair, Mr. Blois, but I just wanted to ask, has there been any discussions with your company or any thoughts on making those partnerships real and including some type of carbon credits for industry representatives?
Yeah, so carbon is an interesting topic for us. When we started from the get-go, we said we need to design a solution that doesn't need an incentive like or a subsidy from the government, a carbon subsidy or other subsidy. Of course, when you're developing technologies, finding investment that's prepared to take the risk on the development of the technologies is a challenge, and this is a role that government can play. We've had some support from the federal government. We're appreciative of that. Obviously, as we scale, we will need more. The solution we've developed can outcompete the landfill. So we've got a solution that doesn't require a subsidy at the landfill end, meaning as a municipality, we can say, we'll save you money and you send the garbage to us. You don't need to have that liability, the long-term liability of the landfill. Certainly they're difficult to permit these days. And our challenge is more the ability to scale our technology, get support from government for the financing required to scale and build larger and larger facilities.
Look, Mr. Vinyl, one of the things that one of the reasons why I'm happy you're before this committee is we are having important conversations on the role of plastics in the horticulture sector. It's been raised by a number of members, and I think probably what I think is encouraging is that there is technology out there that can help separate the crucial question of how those plastics do not go into the environment by the work that your company can do. Obviously, I think there's work to be done on the innovation on the actual packaging side, but for those, to your point, where they're absolute necessity, if we have better diversion programs to not have them into landfills, I think that's one of the key recommendations that can come from this committee. I have been to your facility. I was impressed with it, but one of the things I want maybe you just to share in about 40 seconds that you have left is around some of the agricultural fertilizers, the natural fertilizers from using the basically what otherwise would be food waste in a landfill into a frass type of fertilizer that is showing early promise. Can you just quickly tell us about that?
Yeah, absolutely, and thanks for the question. We soils are degrading across the world in terms of organic content. There's a big push for, circular, regenerative, sustainable agriculture. At the same time, that organic material is coming out of the soil is, food waste and other products like that ends up in a landfill where we lock it in a plastic-lined, inefficient bioreactor where 50% of that methane escapes into the atmosphere. What we have done is we can take municipal solid waste, take that organic material, separate it, put it into a form as a fertilizer. We've gained CFIA certification, the first of a kind, we believe, in Canada, to take waste product, garbage, separate the organics, put it in a form that is clean and has high nutrient value and can be used as a fertilizer. So we've pioneered that pathway in Nova Scotia. We're in active trials now, and I'm sorry that was more than 40 seconds, but we're hoping to scale that part of our business as well.
Okay, thank you very much. Maintenant, Monsieur Parent, 2 minutes 30 secondes.
And Mr. Parent, 2.5 minutes. Thank you, Chair. Mr. Gervais, I'm happy to have you with us today and to see you again. In fact, it's pleasant that you're here today because earlier I spoke with Mr. Forêt about interest rates and costs and support requested from the government to help with that. And FCC, in a way, that's your mission. One producer mentioned to one of our MPs that there were 18% charges on delayed or late amounts. Don't you think that is high? I was surprised to see that, quite frankly. Quite frankly, could you explain to me that policy and how you adjust according to the viability of the business in that case? Well, being aware of that specific situation that you mentioned, normally what happens is that when we go into a situation where there's a late payment, we work on it right away. The ideal approach is to be proactive and be able to redraw a calendar of payments and spread out the amortization and find a way to base it on particular product or different calendar of payments, and to have a part without interest, and then interest, for example, accumulates even if it's not required at that exact time. There are different situations that can occur, and this is normally what happens to be able to get back to a performing loan. So perhaps the idea of a charge here is a definition, but we need to find a way to restructure schedule of payments. Thank you for the answer. It reassures me a bit, but I wanted to raise this with you because I thought it was considerable with regard to your mission. Thank you for the answer. Mr. Forêt, I have about 30 seconds left. Do you have anything you can tell us that hasn't been said yet that would be important for the committee to consider? In fact, I invite the witnesses, if there's anything you'd like to raise specifically, you may also send it in writing, any recommendations after the testimonies. Well, what I would conclude is by saying that, as was mentioned several times today, the speed of the programs and the entire system surrounding agriculture needs to be as responsive as agriculture is. So when we're in production, we have to be very efficient on a day-to-day basis. We have to continue taking care of things 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. There's no stop in production. It's an ongoing process. So it's important to have programs that are assisting us on an ongoing basis and responding quickly, and really not take 6 months or a year to get an answer. I consider that unacceptable. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to turn my final question to Mr. Gervais from Farm Credit Canada. And I know you had an exchange earlier with Mr. Drouin. I missed a little bit of it, so apologies if I'm covering some of the same ground. But, you know, repeatedly before this committee, and in particular in this study, we have heard a lot about the impact that climate change is having on farm operations. And given that Farm Credit Canada is so central to farm financial success, you know, you had mentioned that you have 3,576 clients who work with Farm Credit Canada who are in the horticulture industry. I guess what I want to know from your perspective is, you know, looking forward into the next decade, the next couple of decades, knowing what we now know with these extreme weather events, you know, for example, in British Columbia, we saw in 1 year, we saw a massive heat dome followed by an atmospheric river. We know that Western Canada is facing extended drought forecasts for this summer, where snowpacks and water reservoirs are at a fraction of where they should be. What does that do to Farm Credit Canada's risk analysis going into the future? You know, if farmers are going to be continuously pummeled by this, and it may result in late payments, struggles with loans and so on, like what does that do to your overall risk analysis in the next decade and even further on?
Yeah, so taking a long-term, so thanks for the question. Taking a long-term perspective, what we're doing is we feel that we need to position and support our customers and the industry transition to a low carbon economy, because otherwise we're going to be exposed to way too much risk stemming from climate change. So we're starting right now in terms of putting incentives, in terms of adopting production practices that are going to lower the carbon footprint on the different operations. We offer software solutions that we think can also improve the sort of the carbon footprint on the farms. And we can also put together a sustainable finance framework that will allow operations to introduce new production practices, to introduce new technology again. So it is really a long-term challenge that we have in front of us. We must not forget that there's a food affordability challenge as well that we have in front of us in terms of feeding a growing Canadian population in the world, frankly, because the world needs more of Canadian ag. And so all of that together, I do think that by acting now, we can actually deal or manage the risks that we are going to face going forward. And so what we're doing in terms of risk analysis, without getting into the details too much, is just to promote or to assess the financial risks over a long period of time, right? So what we do, we call stress testing FCC's resiliency for to be able to serve the industry, as well as testing the resiliency of the industry going forward.
Thank you very much, Mr. McGregor. Thank you, Mr. Gervais. Et au nom de tous les membres du comité,
on behalf of all members of the committee, thank you very much to our witnesses for your testimony and the work you do in the sector in general.
suspend colleagues to get turned over for the second panel, but thank you to our witnesses. Thank you for your work, and we'll see you in just a few minutes. Meeting suspended. rock and roll. So if you have conversations, take them outside, please, s'il vous plaît. Les conversations à
If you
l'extérieur.
please, any conversations, please take them outside the room.
Continuing our panel, and today we have, as part of the second panel, Frank Stronach, who is the founder of Magna International and founder and chairman of Stronach International. But I think he's going to talk farming and the good work he's doing in that space as well. From the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute, we have Dr. Al Mussel, no stranger to this committee. Great to see you back, Dr. Mussel. And avec Fermier pour la Transition Climatique, Geneviève.
And we have Geneviève Rosenbacher, Farmers for Climate Change, Director of Policy. Welcome to our committee this afternoon.
Statement, and I'm going to start with Mr. Stronach. Over to you for up to 5 minutes, please. Oh, you're just on mute, sir.
A garage and built up a company of over 170,000 employees. 12 years ago, I decided I will get out of the big car business and go into agriculture. The more I got into the agriculture, I saw this huge chemical jungle. We know approximately 95% of the food eaten comes from industrial farms. On industrial farms, you see no more eagles fly, for the simple reason there are no more rabbits, no more pheasants. We kill everything. The pesticides, fungicides, herbicides gets in the air, we breathe the air, gets into the water, we drink the water, gets into the soil and we eat the food grown in the soil. Family farms were always the backbone of Canada. A country which could feed themselves never had a problem, but family farms are practically on welfare. The children of family farmers say, Mom, Dad, I don't want to be in a farming. I don't want to be on welfare. There are so many indications and statistics that practically all the kids have allergies. The enormous rise of stage 2 diabetics and autism is on the rise. Most well-to-do families feed their kids organic foods. But I believe in a Canada where every kid has an equal chance to grow up healthy. That is not the case anymore under the circumstances. So my recommendations are, no Canadian kid should go to school hungry. That means breakfast has to be served. No Canadian kid should leave the school hungry. And the law would state that the food served in schools would have to be organic. I do believe that if people make statements, we cannot afford to feed organic food to our children, that would be a very poor statement, because the medical cost, savings would outweigh the cost of producing organic foods. I believe Canada should take a closer look. How can family farms survive? They could survive and do well if Canada has a special program to support family farmers which grow organic foods. I hope the Minister of Agriculture takes a serious look at my recommendations. The subject is very dear to my heart. It is important that all Canadian kids have a chance to grow up healthy and happy. I would make myself available to go into more details on how to grow healthy foods for Canadians. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Stronach. We'll now turn to Dr. Al Mussel for up to 5 minutes, please.
Mr. Chair, honorable members, I'm pleased to appear before you today and to provide my insights as a researcher at the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute. Horticulture is an essential element of Canadian agriculture, of secure access to nutritious food, an important source for food manufacturing, the basis for Canadian export-oriented industries, and one in which Canada has an importing interest, both off-season and throughout the year. Horticultural products, edible and floriculture or nursery, have ranged around 12% of total farm cash receipts, recently valued at just under $11.5 billion, but represent a far smaller share of agricultural land. Exports of fruit and vegetables were recently valued at about $125 million, and of flowers and ornamentals of almost $225 million. Processing of horticultural crops is economically significant regionally within several provinces. Work by CAPI doctoral fellow Kushank Bajaj at the University of British Columbia has found that Canada is dependent on imports for about 80% of its fruits and 60% of its vegetables, and the dependence on imports exceeds this in some provinces and territories. Canada's northern climate has limited the output and extent of horticulture. However, some of the key factors are changing. The data compiled since 1948 and even earlier show that much of the country is warming and receiving more precipitation. The greatest warming and increase in precipitation is in the winter and in northern Canada. But nonetheless, these changes are allowing for increased crop yields, movement of new crops into areas in which the climate has previously been unsuitable, and movement of agriculture into regions with climates that have previously been unsuitable to be farmed. It presents the prospect for growth in horticultural crops in Canada. New developments in controlled environment agriculture and/or vertical farming provide some call for optimism for Canada's ability to supply fruits and vegetables locally, including in northern regions of the country, according to another newly published report by CAPI doctoral fellows. However, this entails multiple challenges. Just as warmer and wetter promotes plant growth, it promotes crop diseases and pests, some of which have been foreign to Canada in the past but are beginning to be seen in Canada due to changes in climate and require an effective means for control. Canada will require research to support controls, enable or generate access to new crop varieties because of climate change, and the ability to expedite registrations to make these products available to growers. The meaning of warmer and wetter in terms of local windows of time with favorable weather for fieldwork needs to be better understood. It will need to be met with plans for a workforce accordingly, including temporary workers called upon to work a longer season. Crop insurance, relied upon heavily by horticulture industries to underpin investments, faces multiple challenges. It requires an adequate level of acreage and frequency of independent management in which to establish insurance programming, which can be a challenge in provinces where horticultural crops are minor. Similarly, crops that are newly introduced in a province lag in terms of availability of insurance, as the data required for due diligence must be acquired and analyzed. The multilateral rules-based trade environment, which has facilitated export-oriented horticultural industries and allowed Canada to confidently meet much of its needs for fruits and vegetables through imports, is eroding. Canada has played an active role in attempts to revitalize the WTO and rules-based trade, and this should continue. However, a prudent strategy would reduce some dependence upon imports through exploration of expanded horticultural production in Canada and the challenges this entails. Thank you again for the invitation, and it's my pleasure to respond to questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mussel. We'll now turn into the room to Ms. Grossenbacher. Over to you.
Mr. Chair and members of the committee, thank you so much for having me today. I'm here representing Farmers for Climate Solution and also as Director of Policy, but also as a farmer myself. I grow vegetables actually on the outskirts of Gatineau, just on the other side of the river. My husband and I were the proud winners of Canada's Outstanding Young Farmers Award in 2021 in Quebec. FCS, Farmers for Climate Solution, is a farmer and rancher-led national coalition with 29 member organizations across the country, representing over 20,000 farmers and ranchers, all working to scale up climate solutions in agriculture. We advance policy proposals grounded in on-farm experience to better support producers in the face of climate change, and we also encourage the adoption of low-emissions, high-resilient practices via our Farm Resilience Mentorship Program. For FCS, it is clear that the horticultural sector faces unique challenges due to its high-value, diverse, and perishable crops, and the fact that BRM programs were really not designed for horticulture. Because of that, we really feel we need to act on two fronts urgently. We need to improve BRM programs to reduce risk for governments and farmers, to provide timely support to farmers, something you've just heard, and to incentivize the adoption of climate-resilient practices. We also need to double down on resourcing existing and new programs that build on farm climate resilience to prevent crop losses. We really must act now. The urgency cannot be overstated. The climate is changing faster than policy measures and BRM programs can adapt, and our sector is especially vulnerable. I wanted to share you a story from a farmer that I met recently that exemplifies just the need for action. Richard is a mixed vegetable farmer cultivating 600 acres of land in Annapolis Valley in Nova Scotia, in the writing of Mr. Chair. Last year, due to relentless rains, he lost 40% of his crops, amounting to $320,000 in damages. This level of loss is unprecedented in his 45-year career. Thankfully, Richard is amongst one of the few lucky farmers who subscribe to Agri-Stability. But the $80,000 he will get for that program, when he gets it, falls very short of covering his actual financial loss. So Richard now faces the really distressing challenge of having to dip into his retirement savings to have money to plant this year. This situation shows how urgent it is that we find ways to better support farmers. In a good year, horticulture farmers don't make enough money to cover bad years. Farmers like Richard should not have to underwrite the cost of crop losses due to extreme weather events. High inflation and interest rates are putting the industry's already thin margin at risk. Our sector is vulnerable and the cost of inaction is high. As Richard put it, businesses are used to taking risks, but our sector is currently on very thin ice. We are very much at risk of losing farms, and this would be terrible for our economy. It would drive food prices up and food insecurity up. Existing programs, BRM programs, fail to meet the unique needs of horticulture farmers due to several key reasons. Number one, there's a very low uptake. Horticulture farmers find that programs are not tailored to their unique needs or crop diversity. For instance, in Nova Scotia, only 14% of total acreage was covered by crop insurance in 2021. Two, premiums are often too high. For instance, for Richard, the crop insurance for crop insurance is quite prohibitive. It would cost him $40,000, nearly 4% of his gross sales, which would eat a large part of his profit margin. Number three, there's a high loss threshold, meaning that compensations are triggered at very high level of losses, leaving farmers vulnerable to most losses they experience. Number four, the coverage is inadequate and unclear. With horticulture covering over 200 different varieties and crops, farmers are uncertain about which crops are covered and what minimum land required for compensations to kick in. This is really, this disproportionately affects diversified farms. And actually, farmers that diversify to mitigate their own risk feel penalized by existing programs. Further, as you heard, farmers face long delays in getting compensated. This has a big impact on their ability to recover from their losses. So in a nutshell, horticulture producers are already at a high risk due to climate change. To boot, they don't have real safety net in place. This must change. Also, as extreme weather events become more frequent, BRM programs are becoming increasingly costly. So for instance, in 2023, crop insurance payouts in Canada reached $3.88 billion, up $1.7 billion in 2020. To tackle this issue, FCS formed a farmer-led expert task force to identify specific ways to improve BRM programs. In their 2022 report, which I would happily circulate to the committee, the task force recommends that, one, we make improvements to key programs like agri-insurance, agri-invest, agri-stability to reduce risk for governments and for producers by incentivizing the adoption of climate-resilient practices. Number two, we also need to make sure that BRM programs, again, you've heard this, they need to be affordable, accessible, tailored to the needs of farmers and horticulture farmers, and ensure timely compensation when disaster strikes. Number three, reforming BRM programs will not be enough. So number four, we also need to double down on invest in existing and new programs that build on farm climate resilience to prevent crop losses. Programs like the popular and oversubscribed On-Farm Climate Action Fund, the OFCAF program, are crucial examples of programs that need further investments and resourcing. We really cannot wait until 2028 when current programs expire to act. Action is needed now. On that note, thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. And you mentioned Richard. I know he's a regular participant who will watch in on committee proceedings and certainly one of the best in the country in terms of his knowledge on risk management programs, who did a lot of work. Assuming it's the same Richard, King Sance is a small place. He's done a lot of work on the Canadian horticulture. So if you're watching today, Richard, we appreciate your work. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ms. Rood for up to 6 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to the witnesses for being here today. Mr. Stronach, in your opening remarks, you referred to farms as industrial farms, organic farm versus organic farms, and the traditional farms as industrial farms. And I have to say, Mr. Stronach, you're a businessman, you're very well known, successful businessman, but as a farmer, I take offense to that, and I'm sure a lot of farmers that are watching this right now take offense to you calling us industrial farmers. We're business people as well, Mr. Stronach, and we're trying to make a living at farming. And we heard from witnesses in the previous panel how difficult it can be to make a living. And And so I just want to set the record straight that family farms work very hard in this country, and many of us are incorporated because of various reasons to make a good business model. And we work very hard to produce the best food for Canadians using the least amount of chemicals, using the least amount of inputs as possible. And so I just want to correct the record on that. And sir, you're known for having a strong commitment to the environment and to conservation and sustainability. And we've seen this government has proposed regulations banning plastic food packaging. And we've heard of a Deloitte report that says that food waste and spoilage will increase drastically, actually by 50%, and it will increase greenhouse gas emissions by 50% from food wasted. I'm just wondering if you can comment on if this is a good business decision coming from the government.
First of all, I like to say the last thing I want to do is to criticize farmers, because I think to provide food is the most noble profession I think people can do. When I refer to industrial farms, I refer, farms which are quite a few hundred acres or a few thousand acres, where you do single crops, or where you haven't got a lot of variety, right? And nature can take care of itself if you leave it reasonable alone. But still, the fact is, when you have large farms, where you got maybe 500 acres of corn or soya, whatever, a lot of chemicals are used, fungicide, pesticides, etc., and the plain fact is, on those farms, you don't see no more eagles fly. Why? Because we poison everything. So that's the problem. And again, practically every kid has allergies. A great percentage of kids have the rise in diabetic stage 2 and autism, right? I mean, we got to wake up. We use too many chemicals to produce foods, so we got to wake up.
Well, Mr. Stronach, I can tell you from my experience and all of the farms I've traveled to across this country, I saw eagles fly over the farms in British Columbia when I was out there a couple weeks ago. I see lots of wildlife, and I disagree with that statement. My family used to farm over 1,000 acres of potatoes, and many farms are big, and they're family farms. They're owned by families, and the truth of the matter is they have to have large farms in order to succeed in this industry in Canada. It's very hard to compete as a small farm anymore. So, Mr. Stronach, we've seen around the world that experiments that have happened, and I'm going to turn over to Mr. Mussel for a moment. We've seen what's happened in Sri Lanka when we talk about organic farming, and when you take away all of the pesticides and the inability to actually produce food. So, Mr. Mussel, I'm just wondering if you would comment on that and what we've seen in Sri Lanka, and should we legislate organic food for kids in school?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I don't think we have the luxury to legislate organic foods. There's I think a number of concerns there, but the biggest one, you started your question off with Sri Lanka. What occurred in Sri Lanka was essentially the agricultural system fell apart when they stopped using fertilizer and at least certain pesticides. Look, we have to make prudent use of fertilizer and pesticides. This is to be taken as a serious matter, but we can't simply do without. And I would direct you to some of the research done at the University of Manitoba, in which we found that 40% globally of the adequate diet based on protein can be directly mapped back through to the Haber-Bosch process that produces artificial nitrogen. So look, there's a certain group of people who can afford organic food. These are personal choices, and I don't advise people on personal choices. However, the idea that this is a widespread solution, I believe, is incorrect in my understanding of it.
I'd like to make a few comments on that. You know, I like to see a Canada where every kid has the same chance to grow up healthy. And when you look back 50, 60, 70, 80 years ago, there were hardly any, people hardly had any allergies. Okay, so we started to use so many chemicals that, look, all the kids are practically sick. And yes, you still see eagles flies in the mountains and where there's no farming. Of course you see eagles fly, right? But industrial farms where you farm single crops in large quantities, there's no more rabbits there.
Mr. Stronach, I would love to invite you to come to my farm or to any farm in my riding of Lambton, Kent, Middlesex, where you can see the wildlife, the plethora of wildlife that lives in the area amongst all of the agriculture that takes place there.
Rude. We're at time. Thank you, Mr. Stronach. I think one thing we can all agree is the importance of food in school and early education, and good to see some of the measures that were introduced recently. Ms. Taylor-Roy, I'm going to turn over to you for up to 6 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses for being here. We've heard from numerous witnesses today the importance of sustainable food, local food, food security for Canada. And Mr. Stronach, I know that you've put a lot of time and effort into the foundation, GUHA, that you started to ensure that children do have access to healthy food, and I'm proud that our government has introduced a national school food policy. Could you explain a little bit when you're talking about industrial farms, what it is about those farms that you feel are problematic for childhood health, and why you think organics would be better for children?
Well, first of all, in industrial farms or large farms, a lot of chemicals are used, fungicide, pesticide, etc., etc. Those are known facts. And everybody, every chef or most people, on foods where a lot of chemicals were used, they're not as healthy than organic food. And organic food, you cannot grow in huge, large. You need greater varieties of crops, and nature will take care of itself. So anybody again saying, look, we cannot afford organic food for kids, I think that's a very bad statement, because the medical costs are huge compared to what we would have to maybe spend on extra time for organic food. So I think the future generation will not look too greatly on the people now which use a lot of chemicals in grown foods.
Thank you, Mr. Stronach. And I know that you are in the farming business, that you have an organic farm. And I'm wondering if you can talk about what the government can do to help with the transition, because we know we can't just cut off all fertilizers or pesticides, but that there is a transition, like in the oil and gas sector, where we have to transition to renewable sources of energy. And we heard earlier from the founder of a company called Sustain that are working on more organic fertilizers from food waste, actually. And we know there's a lot of approaches to controlling pests through natural mechanisms. So what do you think the government can do to provide leadership or to help make the transition from using more harmful chemicals to using more natural organic methods?
I said early on, a country which could feed its people. You know, family farmers were always the backbone of Canada, and they could feed the Canadians, right? So it's very important. But right now, family farms cannot compete with industrial farms. And thereby, I think we could have set up a family trust fund, and whereby family farms, if they farm organic, they will get a subsidy. It's quite simple. I think we should have a great concern. I mean, the sicknesses which go, the rise of stage 2 diabetics is enormous, and autism. When you read most medical books, you could see what the problems are. So to say we cannot afford, that's the wrong statement. Because we should do everything we can that our kids have a chance to grow up healthy. And 50, 60, 70, 80 years ago, they grew up healthy in Canada. Why can't we do that now? Yes, there's more people living now, but we could utilize more farmland and grow organic food.
Thank you, Mr. Stronach. And just one last thing regarding young people and keeping our farms in Canada, because we've heard a lot in this committee about young people not getting into farming, not even being able to afford it or interest in it. But I've noticed in my experience that there are a lot of young people who are interested in smaller farms, organic farms, local farms. Have you seen that as well, and how do you think we can encourage young people or support young people who want to start these kind of farms?
Well, basically, we should have projects and programs where farming is cool. That farming is the most noble thing to do. I think with the right approach, we could interest a lot of young people to get into organic farming. But again, it should be recognized when you do organic farming. And I'm not speaking for myself. I don't take any government money, so I do on my own thing. But I start to accumulate a lot of experiences and I know how difficult it is, but it takes a different approach to organic farming. You got to have smaller varieties of foods you produce, and nature will take care of itself.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Ms. Taylor-Roy. Thank you, Mr. Stronach. And certainly the importance of regional and smaller farms is something this committee has focused on in terms of the backbone. I know Monsieur Parent has been a great champion in that regard. Allez-y, s'il vous plaît.
Please go ahead, sir. Thank you, Chair. And thank you to the witnesses for being here today. We appreciate your presence. Ms. Grossenbacher, I have a lot of questions for you. I'll try to be efficient. You said that we need to improve our programs and we cannot wait till 2028. And you made a recommendation that's urgent to bring the people together at the table to look at this urgently. Thank you for the question. Yes, indeed. It is indeed urgent. We've heard more and more about that. And with the kinds of losses we're hearing about, it's not tens of thousands of dollars, it's hundreds of thousands in losses. There was an episode of the La Semaine Verte, a TV program a few months ago about the distress of people, vegetable growers, because of climate change and losses they have, and the programs are not supporting them. And a number of farms are now asking or thinking whether they can keep going. I have a different hat. I am in an environmental organization that provides mental health help to farmers and their families and employees. And increasingly, since last summer, almost every week, at least two farmers come to see me, and quite seriously, they say, I don't know what to do anymore. I don't know if I can keep my farm. Maybe I'm better to get out of it now before I lose my shirt. And if we don't take action now, I guarantee to you that we'll lose some farms. Fine, thank you for the clear answer. So actually, if I tell you that agri-recovery is being asked for by Quebec producers in November, they applied and they on May 6th, there's no answer. You heard the previous witness. I don't think it's going to help. I think we need to be proactive. The previous witness said we need the program to be as responsive and effective as farmers are. Could you comment on that? I couldn't have said it better. Thank you for the question once again. Indeed, the programs need to be adapted. It's not just with agri-recovery, but almost every producer, even the one I referred to, Richard in Nova Scotia, it's the same situation. 180,000 from, or 80,000 he's waiting for from the program, and he needs the money for the coming season that's starting and not a year from now. So the application was made, he hasn't received his money and he's having trouble. I understand that. Thank you, Ms. Grossenbacher. You also talked about the importance of low emissions work and incentives to make the right kinds of actions. So what do you think about a policy that would recognize positive actions for the environment and that would reward them concretely financially for producers. It would provide amounts for their future investment in order to be able to survive, quite simply. What do you think about that? Once again, thank you for the question. Central to this, our request is, yes, we need to review the programs, but we need to look at how we can better serve farmers, especially in horticulture. The answer is that we're not supporting them now. And indeed, having programs that we can look at how we can reward good practices in farming that build and solidify resiliency of the farm, which is what we need. Is it through reward or compensation programs? We can explore a number of models, but we really need to focus on it. It's key to better supporting farmers and to building their climate resiliency on the farm. Do you think it would be fair to also recognize what has been done in the past? In other words, someone who, let's say, I'll give you an example, has been organic for 25 years, is it normal that they don't receive anything if we encourage others to make the transition? That's a good question. Indeed, once again, absolutely. I know that that's an issue for all programs taken together to recognize what we call early adopters. I know it can be costly. We need to think about how to support them, but at the same time, I would just like to emphasize that right now, there are a lot of programs that do not apply to those who use good practices. It's a bit as if we told them, and it's a lot of the case in diversified farms in horticulture, where they say you have less risk, so you don't need any support. But sure, we have less risk, but when the tornado comes, we have losses and we need that support. And right now, it's missing. But sorry, the question that you asked was actually whether we should recognize what was done in the past. Yes, we need more recognition of people who have been using those practices for many years. When we talk about resiliency, Ms. Grossenbacher, I feel that you have a lot to tell us. For the example this morning with wine producers that I met with a wine operation that in my district that had a freeze and 3 lines of vines that were near the tree lines didn't die because of the trees. So that's one way to look at it. How could we assist in increasing resiliency of farm operations along those lines? What do you think as a compliment about the research and development in Canada and its current status and its financing especially? All of these are good questions, and if you don't mind, I'll answer in English for that.
Farm, and it can take different forms depending on what types of production you have and what you do, what you grow. There's different things that you can do on your farm. Definitely, we need more research and development to see what works best. But at the same time, we already know, and Farmers for Climate Solutions has done tons of work to look at what are the best practices that can reduce emission, but really at the same time build climate resilience at the farm level. Things like cover cropping, nitrogen management, rotational grazing, these are all things that we already know now that we can do. Diversificate for horticulture, diversifying is actually a great insurance policy. And just if I can give you an example of my farm, over the past decade, we've had the worst 2 droughts and the worst 2 floods of the past 100 years. We've also, last year was exceptional, where almost every week we had something. We had early frost, early heat waves. Then we had smog in June and August, crazy torrential rains in July, and 5 tornado warnings through it all. I don't know about you. I've lived in this area for a long time. I had never heard that we could have tornadoes. All this adds so much stress to the farm. But at the same time, as I said, like a tornado hits, I'm not protected. But at the same time, throughout those years, our farm has always been able to produce really good quality, high quality vegetables to our communities. Some of our farmers across the street who do monoculture have been hit really hard. Again, there's different things that we can all do, but on my farm, what has helped me for sure, the diversification. So sometimes one crop doesn't work. Oh, sorry.
Non, malheureusement, c'est temps, mais merci beaucoup, Madame.
Unfortunately, that's the time, but thank you very much for Ms. Grossenbacher and Mr. Parent. And now, Mr. McGregor, you have 6 minutes, please.
I'll allow you to finish your answer there because I was interested in that same line about if you want to expand on it, just the interaction between like how planting a diverse set of crops builds that resilience, but we don't have a BRM program which recognizes that or is even adapting to that.
Yeah, so thank you again for the question. So maybe what I can say, Mr. Chair, to that is to finish the thought. So on our farm, we do a lot of things. Right now, when you say BRM programs on it, like I am currently paying $300 a year to participate in crop insurance, but I know very well that I will never benefit from that. The maximum that I would ever get from crop insurance on my farm is estimated at $32,000, which is only a fraction of what my diversified crops can sell on the market. And that's the other, because we have about 35 different crops, I would never have enough of one crop to actually trigger the compensation. So that's been a real issue. But what we've done on our farm is actually and again, different models for different strokes for different folks, depending on what you grow. But for us, we've really focused on diversification. Increasing our crop rotation is about 12 years. So 12 years for a crop to come back to the same place. We've also, about half of our land is always under green manure or cover crops. Because of that, over the past 5 years, we've been able to double our production on the same amount of land, double our production with half of the resources. So we've shrunk our team by two, used less seeds, but produced twice as much output. This, and again, it has proven to be the best insurance policy that we have on our farm because we've always been able to fare. That said, I will say last year, the level of stress on our farm and other farmers with all the extreme weather events that we were hit with, it was high. Distress was really palpable amongst the community.
So on that note, I mean, I know from my 6 years on this committee that farmers are always wary of an Ottawa knows best approach, but your organization really prides itself on farmer-led solutions. Like these are practices which have been tried and have worked on farms because they're coming from your members who are farmers. And so I guess what I want to know is, and just putting this in the context of a possible role that we could recommend to the federal government, like what are some of the big challenges, like when you look at how some climate adaptive practices have allowed farmers to withstand the ravages of extreme weather events and other farms have not done so well, there's a real difference in how different farming techniques can build in that resilience. So what are some of the big challenges in sort of spreading the word and trying to get more adaptation to happen?
Well, so on one hand, there's the farmer-to-farmer learning that needs to happen, and the government needs to support those types of exchanges because farmers will only put in practice on their farm what they've seen work somewhere else, right? But so there's a lot of things we can do on the farm to scale up those practices. But at the same time, what we feel right now is lacking, and we are really appreciative of the study, is the fact that the government also needs to look at its programs and see where can we support and enhance the adoption of those practices, right? BRM, there's a lot of things that could be done, and again, I can circulate the study through agri-stability, agri-insurance, and agri-invest, small tweaks that could actually make sure that farmers, are compensated for keeping grasslands intact and that sequestering carbon and that helping them when disaster strikes to retain more water, for instance, in their field, or when droughts happen and things like that. So I feel like I'm not answering fully, but there's so many things that can be done.
Totally. And just for my next question, I just want to turn to soil health. I think a lot of us are eagerly awaiting the Senate Agriculture Committee's study into soil health. It's a very long and comprehensive one, and I think they're hoping to table it by the end of this month. We know other countries around the world, like Australia, which has a very similar system of government, has put in a national policy framework around soil health, so they have a national strategy on soil. I've suggested my bill, C-203, I'm going to put a shameless plug in for it, but when you look at how particularly paying attention to the soil by, promoting those carbon sequestration practices and how that allows soil to not only hold more water during a drought year, but also to soak up more water during an excess moisture event. What more could Canada be doing in that regard to promote those practices? Should we be following the example of other countries like Australia, which has looked at its agricultural soils as something akin to a strategic asset?
Again, very good question. We very much look forward to seeing the study when it comes out. We contributed to it too. Obviously, we agree that soil health is really key. Actually, climate resilience, a lot of it rests on soil health. And you've said it yourself, when you have better soil health, you'll be able to better retain water or deal with the different extremes that come your way. We definitely, that's maybe, I can provide more comments directed specifically to soil health, but again, we welcome the strategy.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I'll take
Yeah, we'll give you back those 30 seconds, maybe. Okay, Mr. Barlow, 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thanks for our witnesses for being here. Before I go to my questions, colleagues, I did move or put a notice of motion on April 9th, and I would like to move that motion now. And why this is coming today,
is I went to one of my constituents on the weekend, a ranch near Kananaskis country, and you know, a couple of quarter sections. And Mr. Stronach, you'll be happy to know that we saw a couple black bears, a couple bald eagles, and but what was frustrating with this ranch owner as we were riding horses throughout to his property is his feed bill for his animals went up $1,000 in one delivery, and that $1,000 was completely as a result of the carbon tax on the trucking. So we'd like to highlight the fact that this carbon tax is having a detrimental impact on Canadian agriculture and their ability to stay in business. And this is a family rancher who's Dewey is looking forward to passing on this family ranch onto his grandson and granddaughter here in the next few years, and questioning their financial viability to be able to do that with the impact the carbon tax is having on their operation. So on April 9th, I put forward a notice of motion that I'd like to move now. That over the last few weeks, we received a number of letters from dozens of stakeholder groups representing thousands of farmers, tens of thousands of farmers, and certainly tens of thousands of hectares of arable farmland, highlighting the impact the carbon tax is having on their operations. And certainly through this study, just alone that we've heard, 44% of produce growers are operating at a loss, which certainly isn't a long-term, not long-term viability for their operations. So I asked my colleagues on April 9th if for unanimous consent for the committee to report those letters that we've received from a number of provincial agriculture ministers, agriculture stakeholder groups like the Association of Rural Municipalities in Saskatchewan, Grain Farmers of Ontario, and a number of others, asking for the government to review its decision to increase the carbon tax 23% on April 1st and take a look at the impact this is having on Canadian agriculture as part of the consideration for the debate on Bill C-234, which is coming back later this month. So I'm asking my colleagues for unanimous consent to table those letters in the House as part of the discussion on Bill C-234.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Barlow. So you've basically now there's an opportunity for debate on the motion as it's moved. I've stopped the clock, Mr. Barlow, but I'll open it up to the floor to any of our colleagues who may want to weigh in. Mr. Drouin.
Yeah, lots of respect for my colleague on the other side and the letters that have come forward. I know that those letters are public, so I don't see how that will inform the debate. I mean, 234 is completely in the control of the opposition. And should they choose to read into the record those particular letters, they can do so at their will when it comes up for debate. 234 has come before this committee before. We've dealt with it. It's been sent back to the House, the other chamber, and it came back. So I don't see what more we could add to this particular debate. We know, and I've seen all the letters; they're public. So I don't see what value it would add to the House of Commons. I think most parliamentarians have seen those letters as well. They are in the public domain.
You see Mr. Lewis, and I'll look for anyone else, whether Mr. McGregor or Mr. Parent, if you guys want to weigh in. Go ahead.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I'm just looking for some clarification for you. I don't know if I've seen this, to report the letters it received from stakeholders. So what would this process entail? I'm not sure I've come across this before. Maybe the clerk can help us with that.
I can turn to my clerk, but my understanding is what Mr. Barlow is asking this committee to do is the letters that were received towards the committee would essentially be tabled in the House of Commons. That would be the procedure. There would be a tabling of them. I think it probably would allow for some element of debate if folks wanted to move what has been tabled, but it would essentially be just taking those documents and having them available to all parliamentarians, I think, is part of a parliamentary privilege. Anything I'm missing? The clerk's telling me, Mr. Lewis, that she'd have to check procedurally exactly what is possible and what isn't, I guess. And I guess we'll come back with answers on that. So, colleagues, would you like to adjourn debate? Would you like to continue it? I'm really in your hands at this point. Go ahead, Mr. Barlow.
Certainly, I think we understand the impetus of what I'm asking is that, whether it's myself or the chair would table these letters in the House. I would just like to call for a vote whether or not we would support tabling these letters, which again represent tens of thousands of our stakeholders, highlighting the impact the carbon tax is having on their operations. I would just like us to table those letters in the House of Commons to make that official, and certainly just call for a vote if everyone's good with that.
I did see a hand first, though, Mr. Barlow. I'm going to go to Mr. McGregor.
Thanks, Chair. I mean, my position on C234 is well known. I think just for simplicity's sake, I mean, there's a lot of preamble here, which I believe is unnecessary. So I would suggest just a friendly amendment to my colleague, Mr. Barlow, and just simplify the motion. And it's just simply that the committee report the letters it received from agriculture stakeholders, the Ontario Minister of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs, and the Saskatchewan Association of Rural Municipalities regarding the 23% carbon tax increase on April 1st to the House for its consideration and debate on C234. So just a simple, to-the-point motion. But I mean, I'm okay with having a vote on this, but I think it's important to understand what this would result in procedurally in the House. I've never been on a committee where we've just simply reported letters to the House.
So what we can do, colleagues, is I can ask for some procedural help from the clerk about the mechanism which Mr. Barlow is talking about. I take notice, Mr. McGregor, you've just moved an amendment, offered an amendment to Mr. Barlow's motion to simplify it. But if you would like, we can come back to this once I get some guidance from the clerk. Go ahead, Mr. Parent. Allez-y.
Je vais faire juste un bref commentaire.
Just a brief comment. I agree with what Mr. Trovin said. With all due respect to Mr. Barlow, it's in the hands of the House. It's being handled. The letters are public, so I don't see what this will add. I will be ready to vote on this. Thank you.
So what we can do is, well, the committee members, if they are ready to vote, and we do want to move to a vote, which Mr. Parent said he would. Mr. Barlow has asked. If we want, colleagues, we can vote on what Mr. McGregor has just moved, which is an amendment, up or down on that, and then we can choose up or down on what Mr. Barlow's seeking to do procedurally. Is that how you would like to proceed? Okay. Go ahead, Madam Clerk, if you could, on the amendment that Mr. Barlow moved, Mr. McGregor moved on Mr. Barlow's original motion. So, colleagues, essentially what Mr. McGregor his amendment would do is he keeps given that, and then A, that would stay, and then he goes immediately down to the bottom of the piece and goes regarding the 23% carbon tax increase on April 1st to the House for its consideration in debate on Bill C-234. That's what I had. Go ahead, Mr. McGregor, if we're wrong.
It's just a simple motion that the committee report the letters. So I'm removing the entire preamble. I'm removing the ask for unanimous consent. It's just a motion that the committee report the letters, and then it stays the same on the bottom end.
Committee report the letters it received from agriculture stakeholders. So A to J are gone.
Okay, I'm being asked by the clerk if you could just send it in writing quickly, and we'll suspend just until then time.
I have a commitment at 1:15, and a few other people must have the same thing. Either we could delay the vote till next time, or we can move ahead.
Still have a certain amount of time. Mr. McGregor works pretty quickly, so we'll just wait for about 60 seconds for him to get to the clerk, and we'll go from there. last round of questioning, unless you would like me to continue to proceed, get through this procedural and try to do what we can. We have about 15 minutes more that we could do. So.
Mr. Chair, could I suggest that we finish is there any way that we can finish up with the witnesses so then we can move to this as opposed to having them wait for us to go through the
We don't
voting on
always
the
deal
motion?
in purest procedural terms. I'm quite laissez-faire as your chair, but technically, now that it's been so moved, we have to deal with this piece of business. It is unfortunate, but that's where we go. Okay, I'm going to read this to you, colleagues. We're back. That the committee report the letters it received from agricultural stakeholders, the Ontario Minister of Agriculture, Food and Rural Affairs, and the Saskatchewan Association of Rural Municipalities regarding the 23% carbon tax increase on April 1st to the House for its consideration and debate on Bill C-234. So that is what Mr. McGregor has moved. We're going to proceed to a recorded vote. On the amendment, go ahead.
Monsieur Drouin.
No.
Monsieur Cheng.
No.
Monsieur Lewis.
No.
Monsieur MacDonald. Madame Tetterroy.
No.
Monsieur Barlow.
Yeah.
Monsieur Lew.
Oui.
Madame Rood. Oui. Monsieur Epp.
Oui.
Monsieur Perron.
No.
Monsieur McGregor. Monsieur McGregor.
Yes.
Ultimately, the motion has, the amended motion has failed, so we can go back to the main motion. We can repeat this if you want, colleagues, or if you think it's going to be a similar voting pattern, we can just move on. How would you like to? Record a vote, Mr. Barlow, or not? Okay, go ahead again.
Monsieur Drouin.
No.
Monsieur Cheng.
No.
Monsieur Lewis.
No.
Monsieur MacDonald. Madame Tetterroy.
No.
Monsieur Barlow.
Yes.
Monsieur Lew.
Oui.
Madame Rood. Yes. Monsieur Epp.
Yes.
Monsieur Perron.
No.
Monsieur McGregor.
Gentlemen, give up your 2 minutes.
I abstain.
Going to, So the motion is defeated. Mr. Barlow, you have 2 minutes left in your time.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Dr. Mussel, you were talking about the issue in Sri Lanka, and I just wanted to highlight the fact on that when Sri Lanka went 100% organic, they had famine, and as you said, the agriculture industry collapsed, which we are also seeing in the EU as they force 25% organic there. I think there's a place for everything, but we can't force it. But I understand, Dr. Mussel, that you've been working on policies that are maybe not, carbon tax is a punishing policy. Let's look at things that reward farmers for some of the things they're doing rather than punishing them. Can you maybe talk a little bit about some of the policy ideas that the Canadian Agri-Food Policy Institute would be looking at that would be more of a carrot rather than a stick?
Yeah, sure. Thanks very much for the question. Yeah, we look for opportunities in which agriculture can be a solutions provider. As one of the only a few industries that is capable of sequestering carbon, we look at that as an option, and what options there are to provide incentives for that. As we get into this, a lot of the discussion has been around mitigation, and mitigation is very important, climate change mitigation and what different industries can provide. I do think there is a point in which agriculture is somewhat unique because agriculture, as some of the other witnesses have mentioned, is extremely sensitive to climate and climate extremes. So, when we think about resilience, a lot of resilience in this environment I think, is about adaptation and how we prepare the sector for what it may need to contend with. And I think a pretty aggressive research and development agenda that would pursue that type of resilience around adaptation and look for opportunities for mitigation within that. But it strikes me as pretty clear that adaptation is the most critical and acute need.
Thank you, Mr. Barlow. Thank you, Mr. Mussel. Mr. Lewis, 5 minutes. Over to you.
Thank you, Chair. Before I wanted to start, I wanted to share some of my time with Ms. Taylor-Roy.
Thank you, Mr. Lewis. And I just wanted to say something to Mr. Stronach because I failed to say it in my last session, and that is just to thank you because there are numerous people at your stage and age, Mr. Stronach, with your success, would not be this passionate about the kind of vision that you have for our country. And I want to thank you for caring deeply about our environment, future generations, and our country. And just to say that, you know, we need more people with vision and that see that the way things are not the way things have to be. Helen Keller said the only thing worse than being blind is having sight but no vision. And so thank you for your vision and for what you've done for our country.
And I do want to thank all our witnesses for being here. Maybe Ms. Grossenbacher from the Farmers for Climate Solutions. I'll start with you. First, congratulate you on your Outstanding Young Farmer Award in Quebec, and obviously through today's testimony, it's well-deserved. Farmland needs to be preserved, and for that to happen, we need to know how much farmland we have, because once it's gone, it's gone. So what impact does data collection practices have on policy options? How important is it to measure our land inventory, our soil surveys of rural Canada to understand more about the land that we need to protect? What steps can we take to address these data limitations?
No, again, I appreciate the question. And of course, farmland is really important. It's like the main resource that we can grow food on. So we absolutely need to protect it more. We're losing it too quickly. For sure, data is key to making sure we to better, to have a répertoire of what we have.
Have an inventory.
And also to better understand with climate change, different soils have different capacities to sequester carbon, and with time and what types of practices work on those soils to make sure that we have the best climate adaptation potential is really important. So we do need data strategies for sure. And the good on data, it's such a big topic, but on data itself, there's a lot of data that we already have in terms of, for instance, knowing what are the best practices that reduce or that help adapt to climate change. So that we have, but what it is lacking, farmland. Where is the best farmland? How can we protect it? Different soil types, how can we help us better adapt to climate change?
Would you say that data exists a bit in silos, and that's a difficult way to aggregate it?
For sure. So we've definitely been proning also to have different, to make sure that different governments and the government and industry work together hand in hand to better support, to better merge that data. With data then comes all these questions of who accesses data and what purpose. So, you know, there are questions for farmers, or farmers are scared that the data will be used against them or not have access to that data. So we need to make sure that data is accessible, but definitely.
I thank you. I've got such limited time. I'm going to switch to Dr. Mussel from the Canadian Agri-Food Policy. Start my questioning with one of the most important resources of all, which is water. And especially with climate change, water management is more important than ever. So I'd like to ask you about watershed management, the use of land, forest, water resources in ways that don't harm plants and animals living there. What role do watersheds play in better understanding and managing our water resources for agriculture?
You know, throughout many parts of the country, we do have watershed management units. So, for example, in Ontario, where I live, we have conservation authorities that manage landscapes according to a watershed level. You know, we know that with the warming of the climate, the atmosphere will have a greater capacity to hold moisture, and therefore also to release it suddenly. So I think planning at a watershed level it always was important. I think it's just all the more important.
And what resources, research initiatives or projects have you undertaken to improve water management practices, specifically in agriculture?
We've just come off a a project that looks at different aspects of water management in Canada. The most recent piece on the prospects for irrigation in Western Canada. You know, I think when we think about water, irrigation, conservation, another aspect that we have to bring in here is scarcity. And you know, when we're talking about horticulture, we're talking about climate change. I think an important element of our mindset needs to be scarcity. So we do have global scarcity in farm and food products globally. In Canada's in a fairly fortunate position, but we have to go full circle from sustainability, which includes water management and how we handle soils and so on, around to scarcity, and that's different.
Thank you, Dr. Muscle. Yeah, I apologize. We're over time. I try to be generous, but maybe that's my my sin here as your chair. Maintenant, Monsieur Parent, 2 minutes 30 seconds.
And now, Mr. Parent, 2 minutes and 30 seconds. Thank you, Chair. My apologies to the witnesses for the time lost today. Unfortunately, I have other commitments, so I will not ask further questions, but I encourage the witnesses to send in additional material in writing to the committee if they didn't have time, out of respect for their availability that they made available to us. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Parent. And I know Mr. McGregor has ceded his last 2.5 minutes. So on behalf of the committee, let me thank our witnesses here for the second panel, Ms. Grosson Baker or Bacher? Am I saying it right? Bacher? Okay, great. And I have Mr. Stronach and Dr. Al Muscle. Thank you for your contributions to agriculture, for your testimony here today. Colleagues, we will not be sitting on Thursday. We will be back after the break to study around H5N1 is something that we're seeing south of the border, and we want to make sure that we have a meeting to ensure that we have proper protocols going on here in Canada. So that will be our first meeting back on Tuesday, May 21st. Thank you so much. Meeting adjourned.